My arms were badly burned and there seemed to be something dripping from my fingertips. I saw a schoolgirl with her eye hanging out of its socket. People looked like ghosts, bleeding and trying to walk before collapsing. I looked down and saw a man clutching a hole in his stomach, trying to stop his organs from spilling out. The smell of burning flesh was overpowering. That's an answer to the question of what happened after the Manhattan Project. It's a description of what one survivor of the atomic bomb said happened right after the bomb hit his hometown of Hiroshima in the morning of August 6, 1945. We are sure you know now what this project was all about, creating a nuclear bomb. 3 days after the Hiroshima blast in the city of Nagasaki was hit, in all, reports tell us that these two warheads named Little Boy and Fat Man killed in total 295,325 in Hiroshima and 165,409 in Nagasaki. The devastation was unparalleled. The world had never seen such destruction, and the scientists working on the Manhattan Project had done their job well. The Allied politicians and military men rejoiced. The upstart Japan was shocked to its core, sent down to its knees. It was a disturbing coup de grace at the end of the Second World War, a death blow, and a warning of things that might come. That warning remained in people's minds for years. We're still aware of what power governments possess to wipe out masses of populations with the push of a button. But thankfully, we no longer sit on our sofas, chilled to the bone as some TV program tells us what to do when the strike comes. Thankfully, the powers that be know very well that any kind of nuclear attack is a zero-sum game, tit for tat. Everyone loses. We might now ask the question, what were those guys thinking when they decided to work on a project that could possibly end with large parts of humanity being blitzed from existence? That's what we're going to answer today. It actually all started in Germany, because it was there that three very clever men called Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner, and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission. What does that mean? Well, it's basically, we'll let a scientist explain. Nuclear fission is a reaction wherein a heavy nucleus is bombarded by neutrons and thus becomes unstable, which causes it to decompose into two nuclei with equivalent size and magnitude, with a great detachment of energy and the emission of 2 or 3 neutrons. There's a crude term for this, and that is splitting the atom. All that energy released can be a dangerous thing, as described by the Japanese man who witnessed carnage all around him on that dark day in '45. Anyway, after this discovery, the word on the lab concourse was that it could possibly be used to make a bomb, a very powerful bomb. The Germans were on it, and word got out to the Allied powers that some scientists over there were working on creating extremely powerful bombs of a new type. But to cut a long story short, scientists all over the place were aware of the potential of creating a big bomb using nuclear fission. President Franklin D. Roosevelt got a team together, and it was agreed that uranium was needed because it could provide a possible source of bombs with a destructiveness vastly greater than anything now known. They knew this because an Italian man called Enrico Fermi had been working on nuclear chain reactions. He's sometimes called the architect of the nuclear age. It was discovered that uranium isotopes called U-235 and U-238 could be used for the fission needed to create the explosion. But the former was better. Over in Britain, they had their own project to create an atomic bomb, and that was led by an Austrian scientist called Otto Fritsch and a German-born British man called Rudolf Peierls. We don't want to bombard you with lots of names, but you should know the making of the atomic bomb was a massive collaboration and not some eureka moment for some lone wolf messing about with isotopes in a dimly lit lab. Over in the UK, they thought they discovered a way to actually create such a bomb small enough to be carried by a bomber plane. This was big news, and it didn't escape the Americans. In the US, they soon discovered that the British atomic bomb project was bigger and more advanced. Britain then told America that it could have access to any of its scientists and scientific research relating to the atomic bomb. But the problem for a while was that this research didn't always get to the right people in the USA. It was actually an Australian physicist, Mark Oliphant, who managed to visit the States and say, "Hey physicists, there is a lot of stuff you just haven't seen that those winging palms have been working on." We doubt he said it like that, but soon enough anyway, the American physicists had a lot to work with. Okay, so we'll have to cut a very long story into a shorter story. So we know lots of people were collaborating on this project from many places, and we know there was a very real fear that the Germans were ahead. Let's now think of the USA coming in and corralling all these scientists so they could communicate the work under one roof. This was by order of the president, and the military would take control of the project. Not that politicians or military men knew much about nuclear fission, so an American physicist called Robert Oppenheimer was made director. He's sometimes called the father of the atomic bomb, but as we said, this was a complicated endeavor and there was no one inventor. This project was codenamed the Manhattan Project by the American military, but also had the official codename of Development of Substitute Materials. One of those names would stick. The race was on. This is how General Leslie Groves and the Chief of Foreign Intelligence for the Manhattan Project explained why this race was so important. The Manhattan Project was built on fear. Fear that the enemy had the bomb, or would have it before we could develop it. The scientists knew this to be the case because they were refugees from Germany, a large number of them, and they had studied under the Germans before the war broke out. Another leading scientist on the project said this: "I think everyone was terrified that we were wrong and that the Germans were ahead of us. Germany led the civilized world of physics in every aspect. At the time war set in, when Hitler lowered the boom, it was a very frightening time." The thing is, all these people couldn't have been further from knowing the truth. They were leaps ahead of the Germans, and that's partly because they had some of the best German scientists who had all defected on board. Still, the Manhattan Project had to be huge and it was costly. It's said in all about 130,000 people worked on it, and it cost about $2 billion. That might not sound like much, but it would be somewhere in the region of $25 billion in today's money. For the Germans and the Allies, the problem was creating something out of extremely difficult to create raw materials that could be dropped from the sky and then detonated. This was no easy task, and huge factories and labs had to be built to make it a reality. As one German scientist said after he'd heard about Hiroshima, it must have taken factories large as the United States to make that much uranium-235. Just so you know, the first bomb was dropped by parachute from a US B-29 bomber called Enola Gay. The bomb exploded 600 feet above the ground. At the point of the explosion, the air temperature was around 1 million degrees Celsius. On the ground at the hypocenter, the temperature was between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. A mushroom cloud rose about 10,000 feet. A fascinating thing to see to some people from far away, but below lay the ruins of a Japanese city and its scorched and dead inhabitants. A few minutes before that, lots of people were said to be looking up at the sky, wondering what those bombers were doing. We tell you this because in the 1940s, this is exactly what the scientists were trying to create. For years, materials were collected and scientists worked on how to create this bomb. In 1942, two plants built reactors to create plutonium, and also electromagnetic centrifuge and gaseous diffusion plants were built to produce uranium-235. In 1943, raw materials were very much being created, but then bomb design had to be thought about. In 1944, bomb models were tested, and later that year, dummy bombs called pumpkins were dropped in tests. In early 1945, leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin all met to discuss the imminent end of the war. Not long after the American leader died, his last words were, "I have a terrific headache." A few months later, and a plutonium implosion bomb was tested in New Mexico. The new President Truman then told Stalin that America had an ace in the hole, a bomb like no other. On July 26th, President Truman, Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek, and the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee issued the Postum Proclamation to Japan, asking that the country give up the fight and surrender. A few days later, and Japan replied, "No." As you know, on August 6th, the little man was dropped, and 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit. On August 14th, Japan surrendered. That's the end of the Manhattan Project, a multilingual global project that cost a ton of money and human life. In case you're wondering how all that science fit into one place at the end of the day, it goes a bit like this. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima acted a bit like a gun. It was tube-shaped with half of a nuclear charge at one end and the other half, the moving part, at the other end. A normal explosive charge was put behind the moving part, and you might say that was the near end of the barrel. When the charge was detonated, the bullet went down the tube and hit the charge at the other end, sometimes called the spike. Then the two halves of the nuclear materials were brought together and held together, and the result of this was a chain reaction. The fuel became what's called supercritical, and the explosion came next. The Manhattan Project was both a success and a bloody wart on the history of mankind. Some might say these weapons of mass destruction might have prevented other wars, but that's a debate we're not going to get into today. We'll leave you with the words of Oppenheimer: "I have become death, the..."